Technology Rose, and today we're going to be talking about the situation of capital, and we've had a number of parts that we've released on Substack about this, and this has been inspired by the work at Theory Underground on Capital Mondays, and I've really enjoyed that series and the opportunities I've had to be a part of it. And here I'm just going to be explaining a little bit, kind of talking on a few of the parts on what I mean when I talk about the situation of capital, and mainly what I want to discuss is that I think understanding what Marx is doing at the very beginning of the Capital, Das Kapital, part one, really is something that we can understand in light of the work of Leibniz. And everything I do on Leibniz and think is forever indebted to the work of Anthony Morley, his incredible book, Geometry in the Interior. I cannot suggest enough. And everything I know about Leibniz is thanks to Mr. Morley, so I really appreciate his work. And Morley's work on Leibniz has helped me understand Hegel, he's helped me understand Marx, he's helped me understand some of the problems that have arisen in philosophy by being too algebraic and not geometrical enough. So always appreciate Anthony and what he has done. He's a great mind. And I think like what Marx talks about at the beginning of the Capital is this kind of idea that when you experience now, let's say a pencil is not merely a pencil, it is now, say, 50 cents. But this is very weird because there is no 50 cents in nature, right? Human beings have to create it. And yet when I look at a pencil, I experience it as arbitrarily 50 cents. Then it really may not have the ability to motivate or compel action, as it will be if I experience the 50 cents as somehow part of nature itself, which is a very strange idea. But how do I do that? Furthermore, the idea of the pencil being worth 50 cents is only possible if there's a certain logic that a social order puts into play that makes the notion of 50 cents intelligible. And by extension, the logic of exchange has to become intelligible. I have to think that it is possible for, say, one pencil to be worth one pear or one apple. Because if there's some sense in which a pen can be worth an apple, then it's possible from that equal sign to get to a place where a pen equals $1. But there are no equal signs in reality. This is what we learned from Leibniz. You can't, there's only similarity. There is no sameness. There's only situation. And I think what has to happen is in order for a pencil to equal an apple, by which is a logic of exchange, because if you say a pen equals an apple, you're saying you could exchange a pen for an apple, and I may interchange between pen and pencil, so forgive me for that. But you're saying that you can exchange them, right? Well, the equal sign is a logic of exchange. You wouldn't exchange two things that you didn't think were equal. But of course, there's also this weird problem where if a pen and an apple are equal, why would you bother to exchange them? I mean, they're worth the same thing, right? Well, for some reason, the guy who has an apple needs a pen, maybe based on his facticity, and the guy who needs a pen wants the apple, and vice versa, right? Maybe one guy is hungry, the other guy is trying to work on a poem. There's some reason this exchange occurs. But the exchange has to kind of feel just. It has to feel valid. And that's only going to occur if you have the individuals feel as if what they're exchanging is equal to one another. So there has to be an equality between phenomenon that makes the exchange rational to carry out based on facticity. This is where kind of early exchange systems are based. But you see, there's a problem with this, and the problem is that exchange is thus really based to facticity and really can't move beyond it. So you have two things. One, there has to be, the logic of exchange has to become part of a society, and there is no equal sign in nature. And then second, there has to be motivation to carry out this exchange, when the exchange itself would seem, if the things are equal, why even bother to carry it out? To the degree people would bother to carry it out would probably be relative to their facticity and situation, right? Well, that's going to put limits on markets. That's going to put limits on the possibility of exchange, for good and for bad. No, exchange is not inherently bad at all, but it's also not inherently good. And so what you then see is the idea of going, well, okay, how do we get people to exchange even if their facticity doesn't give them reason to exchange? Well, this is where the introduction of the 50 cents becomes important, because I can get someone with a pencil to exchange for an apple if he's hungry. with someone who has an apple that needs a pencil. But how do I exchange a pencil with anybody? Or how do I get a pencil from anybody, even if I don't have something to offer them? Well, this is where 50 cents becomes useful. And if we can all agree that a pencil is worth 50 cents, then anyone with 50 cents could exchange with the pencil. And critically, notice that the money, 50 cents has 50 cents regardless of facticity. You know, an apple only has value if I'm hungry, but 50 cents in a way has value regardless. And so we're starting to move beyond facticity, and we're making exchange possible beyond facticity, you know, because I have 50 cents. But in this, we've now introduced a certain abstraction into reality that is, of course, very dangerous. Because if I start saying a pencil equals 50 cents, well, that's a reductionist act. I'm reducing the pen into 50 cents. Now, if I later kind of open up the 50 cents back into the pencil and I don't lose sight of the reductionism, that can be very, very useful. But there's still a danger here where I keep things as 50 cents and just leave them that way, kind of leave them as a Heideggerian standing reserve. And there's certainly something about the logic of capital and the logic of standing reserve that go together. So anyway, once a pencil becomes 50 cents, then I can sell pencils to anyone with 50 cents who wants one. And if I have 50 cents, I can always get a pencil. So the money, the introduction of money allows exchange. There'd be a motivation for exchange beyond money. So, you know, markets expand in that way. They're not so bound to facticity for good and for bad. And money now is this kind of standing reserve. It is always ready to be employed for something I want. And then, of course, eventually, if you start moving to credit and speculation, you know, the money can become completely severed from its potential to exchange for goods or phenomenon. And we start talking about kind of money being used to create money, credit, and different things like that. And you get into kind of modern markets and creditism and debt and so on and so forth. So I think we can see a line that we can draw. Now, all of that has to be expanded because we can't even say debt is necessarily bad. Debt has a role. Societies without debt can't get loans, they can't get liquidity, and people then are kind of stuck. So we're not saying debt is necessarily bad, but what we're saying is that there's a logic started in capital that we can draw to debt and loans and credit, and Marx will do that. Anyway, so we introduced the idea that a pencil is worth 50 cents. We have 50 cents in reality. But you see, what is how do we justify 50 cents? Where does the value of 50 cents come from, right? Because is it, you know, do I just get some coins and say this is 50 cents? Well, what's the measure? On what grounds is the measure? And this is where the notion of, I think, labor becomes important. And there's the labor theory of value. And we've talked a lot at Theory Underground on the value form versus the labor form and what comes first and so on and so forth. To me, it helps me to think about what Marx is getting at is ultimately being a situation, an entire situation, where labor as distinct from work, because labor has value as the term is social use value. And that's why labor is valuable, because it's distinct from work, say just going on a field and digging a hole, because digging a hole doesn't necessarily have social use value. So that work in a field doesn't necessarily have labor. Now, what's interesting is that once you're in the situation of capital, once you're in that sociological paradigm, then even digging a hole in a field can be thought about as potential labor. But as markets are in their genesis and coming about, there's this distinction where not everyone, and one has to think about someone like a Carl Poirier here in The Great Transformation, which I know Dietrich Maclowski critiques, and I love Dietrich Maclowski, so the conversation between Poirier and Maclowski, I think, has to be expanded on. But anyway, kind of the key notion that we're getting at here is this idea that when you're transitioning from a market economy to a lack of a market economy, from a lack of a market economy to a market economy, there's a certain distinction between labor and work that arises. Even if today now, everything that occurs under capitalism is potential labor, so the line between work and labor is harder to draw. But the point is that labor is defined as social use value. So you have to do a labor that could be socially used. Well, the moment you use the term social, there has to be a society of which can acknowledge labor as creating social use value. So the meaning of the term labor requires a social order, and if there's a social order, there's the possibility of exchange. So what comes first, chicken or the egg? There's exchange, there's this, we've talked at Theory Underground on this idea that exchange retrospectively gives labor value. But then it would seem, I really think it's very important the language that Marx uses, where he talks about labor as quantifying value, as the crystallization of value. And definitely it is the case that labor quantifies value in Marx. Without labor, you can't quantify value. But does that mean labor equals value? In capitalism, practically, yes, it does. But then there's the question of, does it technically create value? And this gets us into the very mysterious topic of value, which gets us into modes of exchange of Carolinie, the old tradition of linking virtue and value together. Value is so odd because it seems like I can value that bookcase there because it was my grandmother's, regardless of the monetary value. But in capitalism, that individual subjective value of the bookcase is not the same as the social use value that comes from the question of labor. So there seems to be a kind of individual phenomenological experience of value and my own values according to virtues. And I know Mikey has noted that a new term than value might be needed because the term value is so hard to use now. Now, for years throughout OG Rose, I've used value in this more virtue sense, this more phenomenological, motivational sense. So, I myself might continue to use value in that way simply because going back and editing everything and changing everything might be difficult, and it's also a habit. But I've also grown. I've grown on the argument that Rudy has also pointed out and Mikey has pointed out that a new word might be needed. So I'm not against that. So if I'm using the term value in this individual subject way, I mean it differently than the value of a capitalist economy. And I also can appreciate the need for a different term, as I also mentioned in my work, talking about Michelle Bowens and talking with Mr. Bowens. Anyway, there's a notion in which labor quantifies value in the economy. So here's the point. If I say a pen is 50 cents, 50 cents has authority because it's supposed to reflect the amount of labor that goes into the pen. So I'd say this 50 cents, what I am buying is the labor that goes into the pen. It takes 50 cents worth of value, or maybe it takes 2 hours of value, that's worth 50 cents. Therefore, based on quantifying the pen according to labor, it is worth 50 cents. So you need labor to quantify the value of the pen. Otherwise, you can't link it up. You can't exchange it with money. And this is what's very tricky, because social use value is meaningful because there's a system of exchange that is a society, but exchange is impossible without the quantification that is labor. So to me, the term, it's a giant situation. We can't talk about like exchange coming first or labor coming first or either or, because they are always already situated together. At the same time, if my value, so labor is the quantification of value, where exchange is the kind of acknowledgement of value. Like without exchange, to say that pencil has value, it's not clear what this would mean, or just be a subjective value. To become a social use value, it needs systems of exchange. So it's a giant situation, always already together. And Shahil has talked about it. Shahil is extremely good on this, talking about, and he also made me appreciate really needing to emphasize labor as quantification. He also made me appreciate that understandings of the labor theory of value that I have been used to for so many years are problematic, like the notion that what Shahil was saying, based on, say, a Lucas, I believe, is that the proletariat needs to ultimately dissolve itself as opposed to become the new people who run the means of production, because the proletariat is already a sociological reality situated within the logic of capital, that in order to overcome the alienation of the logic of capital, the very categories themselves have to be abolished. And I must say that understanding of the theory of value is extremely appealing to me. So I appreciate Shahil bringing that to my attention, and how also labor does have this deep role of being what quantifies value. So it's very difficult to talk about value without labor in a capitalist economy. So I think Shahil is outstanding on that, and I appreciate his lectures. And to me, like I said, the whole situation arises. I think also, personally, I think Marx is writing at a time when sociology is rather new. I think sociology as a term isn't even used until like between 18 and 1900s. And also the structure of time, according to which Marx is writing, is Newtonian, cause and effect. We don't have a relativity. We certainly don't have a Bergson or anything like that. And I think Marx is trying to describe how sociological orders make things intelligible that are nevertheless fictions. Shahil has made the point that, capitalism is a kind of religion that works even if you don't believe in it. That's the fetish. That's the power of capital. Like, even if you think it's all silly, it still works and it still has causal impact. So it's a way in which, quote unquote, God has been made material. It's the God who works regardless if you believe in him. And I think that's a profound way to put it that Shahil is bringing up, which also aligns with Zizek. And I think that also gets into how sociological realities work, which we find in a Berger, a Philip Brief, and so on and so forth. It won't, sociologies create plausibility structures that make certain things that are quote unquote fictions authoritative and real. They have a real causal impact. And so to say they're fake doesn't seem to make sense. Words like fiction no longer apply. And I think what Marx is describing is, in the Capital at the beginning, an entire sociological paradigm that arises all together and all at once to make capital possible. Because Marx is, very interested in how is capital even intelligible? How is the idea of capital even intelligible? It doesn't seem to make much sense, and yet nevertheless it is. So how? Well, the social order has to make it plausible. And then in becoming plausible, it has to gain an authority over the individual who participates in it. And so I think Marx at the beginning is exploring, how is this even possible? How can this even occur? And perhaps because he is stuck in language of sociology before, trying to describe something sociological before the language and structures of sociology are well known or well spread, I think it's difficult for Marx to describe all this, as I think it is difficult when he is stuck in a notion of time that is more linear, because sociological realities are more kind of durational versus sequential. They arise suddenly and all at once. And I think that's what capital is. It is a situation that arises suddenly and all at once that changes the situatedness of all phenomenon in it and our relations to things within all of those. But we can talk about it as a giant conditionalism. A condition is met that changes the meaning and orientation of all things. And so labor is what makes it possible to quantify value. Value is always a social use value, and as such it is also always sociologically situated. And if labor is distinct from work, it is because it has social use value, therefore there's a sociological order. But that sociological order can only function intelligibly if it has some sort of quantifying principle that has authority, like labor. Because here's the other key. If I say a pen is worth 50 cents, in order for that 50 cents not to feel arbitrary, the grounding quantifying principle of it has to feel authoritative, and labor feels authoritative. It's not a mere belief. It is it's facticity. It is work. It is sweat. It is difficult, and so it feels valid to base labor to base value on labor, because labor is hard and there's a limited amount of it, and it takes a lot of work to say get a diamond or something like that. And even if you say on the minimum value hypothesis, what minimum utility hypothesis that you see in the Austrian school, where if you find a diamond, out of nowhere, it has value even if it took no labor. Well, the value has diamond because you consider it relative to the average of diamonds, which is a lot of labor. It takes a lot of work. And yet, at the same time, labor at this point becomes a kind of abstract value that, abstract labor is what Marx will talk about. Labor itself becomes more of an abstract idea of which you are considering the diamond you found in light of. And so that right there would suggest labor is not merely anymore the physical activity of labor, but it takes on an abstract principle, which then is judged into reality by people participating in the capitalist economy. So now there's a relation that is indispensable. You can't reduce. You see, this is the issue. Labor becomes relational. Labor becomes a judgment. Labor becomes an abstraction. And so that right there is why we always have to think about labor as something distinct from the activity of work or the activity of sweat. Because even though the activity of sweat, you could say, is precisely what gives the quantification authority, the quantification gains a life of its own. outside of that sweat. And so now we're dealing with an abstraction all the way down, which doesn't mean it's fake though. Abstract and fake, it's a great error to conflate those. But it gains a non-contingent life of its own, of which comes to organize the thinking of people throughout the social order. And so to me, all of this is a giant situation. And that's why we call it a situation of capital, because I think that is ultimately what Marx is trying to describe. The paper will go on from there. There's many more things we have to touch on. And for more on the topic, please visit Theory Underground, Capital Mondays. I greatly appreciate the work being done on this topic. And thank you so much for your time.